It sure is a pleasure to be here. I'm thankful for the opportunity to talk about religious freedom. Susan is right. Religious freedom, properly understood, actually protects everyone in this country, whether they like it or not, and regardless of what their beliefs are or not. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. My experience with First Amendment generally, so I'm a First Amendment law professor at the University of Texas. I direct what's called the Bech-Loughlin First Amendment Center. I teach freedom of speech, religious freedom, freedom of the press, assembly, the right to petition the government. My experience with First Amendment freedoms and religious freedom in particular is that most people have really strong opinions about all of those freedoms and know absolutely nothing about them. And that can be a real problem. And I learned that lesson when I was very young. So some of you have probably heard this story, but I'll make you hear it again. When I was 9 years old, I was going to summer camp. And I grew up in a little town in New Mexico. My family didn't really have very much money. So we had a small house and we shared one bathroom. And I went into the bathroom and I got the moose. And it was really cool back then for little boys like me with hair like mine to spike it up. So I went into the bathroom and I got moose and I put it in my hair and I spiked it up. And I was feeling pretty good about myself. And I came strutting out of the bathroom. And right when I walked out, my mom came walking by and she started sniffing. And she was like, she said, "What is that smell?" And I very proudly pointed to my head and I said, "It's the moose." And her eyes got really big and she grabbed me, spun me around, pushed me back into the bathroom and rammed my head in the sink and started washing my hair out without telling me what was going on. Turns out that what I thought was moose was actually her hair removal product, Nair. And all of my hair started falling out. And for the rest of the summer, everyone thought I had this horrible illness because it didn't fall out in a uniform way. It was like all patchy. And so I learned a really valuable lesson that you get in trouble in life when you think you understand something, but you don't. And sadly, I would guess for most topics, and especially for something like religious freedom, most of us have much stronger opinions than we actually have knowledge about the topic we're talking about. On that note, and consistent with this theme, I have the theme for tonight. I've recently published a book called Habits of a Peacemaker, and it's habits for how to be able to have productive discourse about difficult conversations. I'm not going to be focused on that tonight since the theme of this meeting had to do with the role of religion in peacemaking. And so what I wanted to focus on was something slightly different, which is the myth that religion leads to warfare, and instead the role that religion can play in peacemaking. So I'm going to be talking about this. I will say right out of the gate that what we have learned through history is that it is not religion that led to warfare. A lot of people think that. In fact, I have a cartoon I'll often show people that has one figure that looks like religion and another figure that looks like a soldier. And the soldier has his arm around religion and says, "Sigh, where would I be without you?" And it's supposed to be warfare, suggesting war comes from religion. But one thing we learn, if you're a legal scholar and you study religious liberty, what you learn is that first off, from a legal perspective, all people have religious beliefs, and that includes the most devout atheists, it includes agnostics. There are certain questions to which the answers are considered religious answers, right? These questions of, is there a God? What happens when we die? And the people who get the most upset about that when I say that all people have religious beliefs tend to be the most devout churchgoers and the most devout atheists. But the only way religious liberty works is if we consider everyone's beliefs to be religious in nature from a legal perspective, okay? And what we end up doing then is trying to structure law in a way that protects everyone. As soon as humanity figured out how to properly calibrate religious liberty law, what we found is that religion-based warfare plummeted. And so it wasn't religion that was leading to warfare, it was a lack of religious freedom. And that was the key insight that really the Western world was able to develop over centuries, the importance of religious freedom and calibrating it accordingly. In all of this, then you can see that there is a problem with talking about people who are religious and people who are not religious. Say religious versus secular. At least in the legal discourse, that's not how we think about things, because everybody is affected one way or another by religious liberty law, regardless of what beliefs they have or don't have. That said, today I am going to be talking more about the types of people that we tend to think of when we say religious, right? So people that are like churchgoers. people who are involved in an organized religion. That's kind of what I'm going to be focused on, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But first I want to tell you about a dear friend of mine. So one of the leading scholars in the world for the last 5 decades on religious liberty laws, a man named Douglas Laycock. And he was my mentor. He's the reason I got into this space, because I just was fortunate enough to take his class by accident. And I just couldn't get enough of it. I just thought it was so fascinating, and I kept digging and digging and digging, and fortunately I've been able to make a career out of it. But Douglas Laycock had been a scholar of religious liberty for decades and had advocated on behalf of various religious groups, including atheists and agnostics, for a long time, but mostly the groups he had advocated on behalf of were various groups that you would think of. So he had done work on behalf of Catholic groups and Protestant groups. He'd done work on behalf of Jewish groups. He'd done work on behalf of the Santeria, which actually is a group down in Florida. It's like an Afro-Caribbean religion that engages in animal sacrifice. And for about 2.5 to 3 decades, Professor Laycock refused to tell people what his religious beliefs were. He would never say. So anyone who tried to figure it out couldn't. He wrote about how he was constantly accused of being a part of whatever religion he happened to be helping at the time. And eventually, he got invited to a conference where the editors of a law review, that's a legal academic journal, convinced him to disclose what his religious beliefs were. And he had always taken what I think is the proper approach, which he has said, look, my personal religious beliefs are completely irrelevant to what I think religious liberty law should be. So I'm just not going to talk about it. But finally, he decided to go ahead and share what his religious beliefs were after doing all this work to help different religious groups. And this is what he wrote. He said, I am an agnostic. I'm agnostic about matters of religion. None of the claims of the world's religions seem to me either plausible or falsifiable. I am inclined to think that humans create God in their own images, that knowing nothing whatever of God, most people impute to God those traits they think an attractive God should have. And then he talks about how when he first got into the religious liberty field, his goal, he was very hostile towards organized religion. And he wanted to get into it to kind of shut down organized religion, keep it from spreading, try to protect non-believers and atheists and others. That was his goal. He felt like religious groups were using the power of government to force themselves upon everybody, and he wanted to stop them from doing that. Over time, though, what he said is he probably got 100 phone calls from people who were of traditional religious groups who were having their religious freedom burdened, compared to every one he got where those groups were actually trying to force their religion on people. And so his attitude started to shift over time, and he became more and more sympathetic to religious believers, and that led him to write this. He went on to say, he said, I went through my period of hostility to theistic religion. I went through my period of stick figure caricatures of believers, and I learned better. I learned that highly intelligent and accomplished people are devout believers. Indeed, they believe that they have personally experienced the presence of God. I learned that believers reason just as well as non-believers on average, and that most people do not see the conflict, most believers do not see the conflict between faith and reason that many secularists posit. I learned that religious faith is a powerful force for good in the lives of many believers. I learned that the great religious traditions often embody accumulated wisdom, whatever its sources. He then explains something that I want to emphasize tonight that I think is critical. He talks about how his newfound respect that he was saying there about religion and religious believers came from, quote, frequent contact with sophisticated believers. In other words, his work in doing religious liberty had exposed him to sophisticated believers, people who took their religion seriously, could articulate what they believe and why they believe it, and he came to have a deep and profound respect for them, even as he said, even if they believed in things he could not possibly believe in or share, right? And so he put this out into the world, and I use that as an example because I want to emphasize his contact with sophisticated believers was the key here, and yet many of us don't have that opportunity to have contact with sophisticated thinkers of beliefs different than our own, right? That becomes very, very difficult. Usually the human mistake is to go ahead and just assume stick figure caricatures, as he did, of people who think differently than we do. and then go ahead and have all sorts of negative opinions about them. And so too many of us aren't given the opportunity that Doug Laycock did. Your average agnostic or atheist in his shoes generally is going to spend a lot of time with other atheists and agnostics, but his field of discipline forced him into contact with people such that it changed his views on things. That's important. One of the problems we have with religious freedom today is if you look at, there's a recent survey done in the Western, like the English-speaking world, well, more of the Western world because it included countries in Europe and other places, about religion and whether or not religion is a net positive on society or a net negative. And for the first time, a majority of adults over 18 said that they thought religion was a net negative on society. And me thinking, well, why is that? Do they truly know why they think that way, and what are they looking at? What are their opinions? And to me, it is not shocking that there are many people who might feel that way. Even people who might believe in a God see organized religion as a net negative on society. And I think part of that is too many of them are never given the opportunity to see the good that religion is doing in the world. So what I want to talk about is this general vibe about religion. Most of us, if we actually think about a given topic, we just have like a sense of how we feel about it, right? Like if I just said the word tariffs to you right now, all of you have some general vibe about that word, good or bad, right? Probably 50-50. So suddenly it's like, my guess is if I were to actually force you to speak intelligently about tariffs, most of us probably couldn't do it with any real depth, right? There's probably some economists in here who could, but most of us probably really couldn't do it with any real depth. We just have a general sense. And religion is the same way. People often have this general just reaction, but they don't really have a lot of depth to what they're actually feeling. And we get this vibe about religion. And the question is, where does that vibe come from? I was in a meeting once at a conference with all of the leading religion reporters in the United States. So we had the leading religion reporters, from the New York Times, NPR, PBS, the BBC, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, I don't remember, some other highfalutin organization. And everybody's there, and they're talking about their reporting on religion. And somebody raised a hand and asked the question. They said, why is it that you never report on the good that religion is doing in society? Or if we do some big interfaith service project, why do you never report on that? And to her great credit, Emma Green of then the Atlantic, now the New Yorker, raised her hand and she said, look, I know that religion does a lot of good in the world and that religious people do a lot of good in the world, but it's not my job to report when things are going well. My job is to find problems and report on those problems. And I don't begrudge her at all for that. That's what she sees her job as doing, right? So if a group of interfaith youth from 3 different religions gets together and goes out and helps people from a tornado disaster here in Iowa, you're never going to hear about that in the news. But if there's one clergy abuse scandal, every major news outlet's going to jump on that and report on it, right? So that leads over time to all sorts of negative impressions about religion. And what I want to do is disabuse some of those negative impressions tonight, because I think they contribute to this notion that religion is actually something that leads to discord and warfare, when actually it's not religion that's doing that, it's a lack of religious liberty. And I want to emphasize, by talking about the good that religion is doing in the world, I am not trying to compare religion versus secular, or I'm not even suggesting that those people who do not see themselves as religious are not also contributing good in the world. But tonight I'm trying to overcome this general sense that people have that all religion contributes to our society are negatives, right? So let me just go through a few things. First off, here's just some stats to think about. Faith-motivated volunteers comprise the largest percentage of volunteers in rehabilitation efforts in U.S. prisons. Almost 60% of the emergency shelter beds for homeless individuals in the U.S. are provided through faith-based organizations. Religious schools organize over 3 million children each year in the United States, and religious hospitals care for 20% of U.S. patients. 74% of all charitable giving in the United States goes through explicitly religious organizations, and 40 out of 50 of America's top charities are faith-based. Just one example, Catholic Charities is working in 115 countries with 2,130 local partners to improve the lives of 140 million people. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I think last year alone, donated $1.42 billion in humanitarian aid. And it's not just organizations that are doing good in the United States as religious groups. It's individuals. You have to think about it at the individual level. So for example, religiously active individuals give financially more and more often to both religious and secular causes. Religious people are 23% more likely to volunteer their time to charitable causes. And they don't just volunteer their time to religious causes. Members of religious organizations are more than twice as likely as others to participate in non-religious community organizations. And finally, religious families adopt children at more than twice the rate as non-religious ones. And these are just statistics that people can report on, that you can identify. Think of the millions of hours of service that is often given by religious people who are members of various faith communities in the United States, that we would never find, right? People who are just ministering to widows, people who are ministering to friends and to the sick and to the elderly, ministers, priests, bishops, rabbis, and others who are doing all sorts of visiting and uplifting and helping the poor that simply will never get reported on because they're not doing it to have the reporting done, right? They're simply making the visits and then returning to their homes unrecognized by the world. All of that is happening, but it's never going to be reported on. It's not going to manifest itself in TV shows and movies, right? Because it's not salacious. I hate to break it to you, but you're never going to break into the top of the ratings by a show about some minister who's just humbly going to visit people and there's no drama or sex abuse involved, okay? You're never going to see that TV show happen, right? People are not going to talk about those things, and yet by and large, religious organizations are regularly and routinely engaged in that behavior all over the world. And it's important to recognize that, because you have to, when we think about the role that religion can play in peacemaking, we have to think about all the good that religion is doing, in addition to some of the negative. And I do not want to suggest that religious organizations have not been involved in negative behavior. They have. And I don't want to suggest that the centuries when we didn't have religious freedom, that religious organizations weren't a part of that. They were. But they were also part of finding the solution, of finding the principles of religious freedom that would then allow this country to exist. And I don't know if we all appreciate just how remarkable this country is. It is the most religiously diverse country in the history of humanity, and yet we largely live alongside one another in peace. That is incredible. It's unheard of historically, and it's mostly unheard of in the world today, and it's because of religious freedom. So again, my goal today is not to compare religious people versus secular people. That is not what I'm trying to do. I actually don't think those categories are helpful or even work. But my goal is to overcome this vague and popular notion that religion is simply contributing more bad to the world than positive. And I want to just emphasize here at the end that if you understand religious freedom and what it's doing, it protects all of us from all of us, if that makes sense. When religious freedom is working popular, I don't have time to go into the legal doctrines here. What religious freedom is actually doing is ensuring that government plays as small a role as possible in all of our religious choices. And when that is working, then people of all religious beliefs, including atheists and agnostics and theists and believers of every stripe that you can imagine, are able to thrive, pursue their religious lives as they see fit, and hopefully then, as motivated by their beliefs, help uplift the entire world around them. Thank you. So with that, I think I have Susan, what do we have? 5 minutes for questions? 5 minutes for questions? Yeah.
The thing that secular people have a problem with is where religious cases like Hobby Lobby are touted as religious freedom cases.
Great, I'm glad you brought that up. So the cases like Hobby Lobby, so cases that involve things like abortion and LGBT rights, those types of cases, actually represent less than 2% of the religious freedom cases in the United States. So they're actually a very tiny, just little sliver of cases. Those cases absolutely do implicate religious freedom law. Now that doesn't mean the Green family who runs Hobby Lobby should win. What it means, though, is that it does implicate burdening their religious free exercise, and then the question is, how should the law respond? And you could make reasonable arguments on both sides whether or not the Green family should win in those cases. But to say that cases are not about religious freedom is a common move that people like to make when they absolutely are about religious freedom. Doesn't mean the claimants have to win, but those cases are at the heart of religious freedom. The only question is whether or not the government has a compelling interest in overcoming the religious freedom claim. Yeah.
So you mentioned that a large proportion of the charitable giving and service and so forth in the country is attributable to religious people. I'm wondering if you have a comment on the demographics of that, because as I'm involved with interfaith groups in our community, most of us have gray hair like me, okay? And there are a lot of shifts going on in religiosity. And so I wonder, what the future might hold for those trends that you were reporting as being current.
Sure. So it's interesting. About 29% to 30% now of the population of the United States identify themselves as what we call nuns, and N-O-N-E-S. But the rise of, say, atheists and agnostics has not increased with that. So what that means is you have people who are no longer identifying with various religious traditions, right? They used to, maybe, for example, they would check a box that said they're Protestant or Catholic or Methodist or whatever. They're no longer doing that. They're checking boxes that say none. But what those people still have are very profound and very interesting religious beliefs and practices that they engage in, many of them. Some are becoming atheists, but you also have to remember people are always moving around, right? Someone can become an atheist and then be converted back to something and then be converted back to being an atheist or vice versa. So a lot of those people are still religious and they're still involved in various means of charity and other things. I think what the shift you might see in the future is if people are not part of organized groups. There's a really fascinating book called Strange Rites that I recommend. It does an exploration of the religious nuns and how they're kind of leaving organized religion. But if they're no longer part of organized groups, will that then affect their ability and their motivation for getting involved in charitable giving because they won't be part of a group that's encouraging them to do so? That's plausible, but we haven't seen that yet. I'll also tell you that we're actually seeing a shift back. So among young men especially, where there was a large increase of people becoming religious nuns, the demographic research is now showing there's a sharp turn back to religion and faith. Sometimes in almost extreme ways that's a little bit troubling. But we're seeing that among a lot of young people, that they're kind of tired of living in a world where they're being told that the only thing that exists is the self, and the only truth comes from the self, and there is no external truth to themselves. That is not necessarily a claim that an atheist or agnostic makes. By the way, atheists and agnostics are as varied in variety as any other religious group you might find out there, right? With all sorts of different beliefs about what it means to be an atheist or an agnostic. But we're seeing a lot of shifts back among young people towards religion again, or organized religion, and that's going to affect what we see in terms of charitable giving down the road. Maybe one more question? Yeah.
With that shift towards nuns, how does it affect the law when if my only truth is coming from myself, how do I prove my sincere religious beliefs to the court? Where you can go and there's publications about what Catholic doctrine is, or what, if there's less in a country of less organized religion, how does that affect religious liberty?
So some people have made the argument that we could be on the verge of a world where everyone becomes a religion unto themselves, and religious liberty doctrine then becomes almost impossible to implement, right? Because if everyone is a religion unto themselves and everyone makes religious liberty claims as to why the law should not apply to them, it'll just be anarchy. That has been the fear related to religious liberty law and protecting people's religious belief and exercise since the founding of the United States. So far, at least, it has not posed a problem. To the extent religious nuns are bringing religious free exercise claims, the courts are still protecting them. And the Supreme Court has long held, going back 50 years or more, that you can have a religion of one. You don't have to be part of an organized religion. You don't have to have be affiliated with some church who declares what your doctrine is. Your sincerely held religious beliefs will get protection. And if we're ever going to end up in a world where that way of thinking about religious liberty leads to utter chaos, we'll have to deal with it at the time. But the prediction that it will lead to utter chaos has been the prediction since the founding of the United States, and it has never even come close to coming true. Does that answer that question? Yeah. And I'll say, and again, this applies to someone who claims to be a non-believer as atheist as well. So one of the more significant religious freedom cases of the 20th century involved an atheist when a state government tried to force him to sign a belief that he believed in a supreme being. And his personal religion at the time was that there was no supreme being. And so he took it to court. He lost at the trial court. He lost unanimously at the state court. And then he won unanimously in the United States Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court said is, you cannot force people to declare a belief in something that they don't have, right? Religious liberty, properly understood, protects everyone. And it's critical to understand that, even people who are on an island by themselves with their religious beliefs. Okay, thank you.